Welcome to the Hearst Lecture Series. I wasn't joking. It's a very important kind of night for us. We bring leaders in journalism, specifically in kind of the digital space, to come talk to us. I want to read a little bit about the lecture series and introduce our guests here. Welcome to the Hearst Lecture Series, which examines the changing media industry with an emphasis on digital media and online journalism. The program is made possible by the generous donation of the William Randolph Hearst Foundation, thus your food, right, tonight. This event is also sponsored by the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security right here at the J School. So I want to get right to introducing my guests. In conversation tonight is Margaret Sullivan, weekly columnist for The Guardian US. She's the executive director of the Craig Newmark Center for Journalism, Ethics, and Security. This marked her return to Columbia Journalism School, where she previously taught many courses for us. In her role at The Guardian, Margaret writes on media, politics, and culture. Come on up, yeah. Our other special guest is Jessica Huseman. Very special to bring back because I've known Jessica for a while. Jessica is the editorial director of Votebeat, which she helped found in 2020. She manages projects and investigations for the newsroom's 5 coverage states: Arizona, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Texas, and Wisconsin. She was previously the lead elections reporter for ProPublica and helped manage the Election Land project for 3 federal election cycles, 3 of them. Sharing information and tips with hundreds of newsrooms across the United States. She is an award-winning educator and is taught right here at the J School, New York University, and wrote a high school investigative journalism curriculum in use by more than 200 high schools, and developed St. Bonaventure's introductory data journalism course. She teaches a course on government transparency in the spring semester at American University, and most proudly, she is, at least for me, is a 2015 graduate of the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. So Jessica, come on up. I'll let you take over, but how?
You ready?
Yeah, right.
Take over?
You can take over, right?
All right.
But I just want to welcome you and thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean. Well, hi everyone. And because some people came in late, I want to tell you one of the most important things about this evening, which is that there will be a really nice spread of food and drink in the World Room after this talk is over. So we will go from now till about 7:30. There will be a Q&A portion, so we're going to talk, and then there will be Q&A, and then we will repair to the World Room. So it should be fun, and thanks for coming. So I want to start off with, on a personal note, with Jessica. Not too personal, but Jessica was my student, actually, in 2015 when I taught as a lowly, well, I hope I'm not, maybe I shouldn't say lowly, as an adjunct here at the J School. That's a terrible thing to say. Scratch that. Anyway, I was an adjunct, and I was teaching a odd course called Audience and Engagement, and Jessica was in the class. And just for a moment, before we get into all the good stuff about innovation and digital journalism and your career and the future of journalism, just please tell us what your project was in my class.
We were all assigned to create a Tumblr, and we had to create a following for it. Does this age me? I think it may age me. And so we decided, me and my group, who I still remember, did a blog fact-checking Ted Cruz called Cruise Control. And
it was good.
Yeah, and it was good. And I even fact-checked a Ted Cruz coloring book, which exists.
There you go.
Terrifyingly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it was, we go back a ways. So let's plunge into the heart of this, which is the very interesting place called Votebeat that you helped to found and you are running as editorial director. So tell us a little bit about how it came to be, and I've noticed we have an election coming up. I heard a rumor. So how is Votebeat interacting with the election right now?
Yeah, so Votebeat is sort of In 2020, oh goodness, I think July of 2020, this was really quite close to the 2020 election. Elizabeth Green, who is the CEO of Civic News Company, that's what the parent company is called now, but at the time it was Chalkbeat, came to me and said, hey, what if I did a pop-up newsroom in 7 states that just covered election administration? And I was like, do you know that the election is in like 3 months? And she was like, yeah. I was like, great, go get $1 million and come back to me. And she totally did. And so she raised the money, and I sort of helped them pick the states. I was still at ProPublica at the time. And then after the 2020 election, I decided to come over as editorial director. It was a pop-up, then it was a 2-year project, and now it is a permanent newsroom, which has been a fascinating journey in like uncertainty and job insecurity. But welcome to journalism, guys. You have so much to look forward to. Anyway.
What is Votebeat, and what does it do, and what do you want it to be doing?
Yeah, so we cover voting policy, and we're really, really specific about that. We don't cover the campaigns. We do not cover the claims that the campaigns are making unless they're talking about voting and voting policy. We are a really policy-focused newsroom. And so if you go to any of our 5 websites, what you'll see is stuff about voting locations. You'll see data analysis about what types of voters are best served by the specific policies in place, what types of voters are most negatively affected by those policies, explainers on how the process works. And our idea, really, sort of, and I sort of feel, you know, this feels silly to say, but I think like the existence of our newsroom was justified by January 6th. And what I mean by that is I think that newsrooms across the board do a really poor job of explaining the mechanics of voting and the mechanics of election, right? And so all of those people that stormed the Capitol had these bananas ideas about what the Electoral College was and how it functioned and the role that Vice President Pence could or could not play on that day. They had really strange ideas about how the voter rolls worked and how prevalent voter fraud was. And they were kind of screaming all of that into an empty chasm because there wasn't anything in the media that would dispel those myths, right? Unless they were being reactive, right? There was nothing proactively on any news organization's website, like, this is how we're gonna certify the vote. This is how certification works. And so because that wasn't out there, it was really easy to just sort of like spread whatever, and people believed it. And so, you know, I think that that's really what our focus is making sure that people aren't just writing about campaigns, that they're not just writing about
The horse race,
but that they're talking to city and county clerks, which until now has been a pretty sleepy job, but now is
it's hot.
H-O-T.
Right. So who is your audience? Is it regular people, or is it, you know, politicians, or is it policy people? Or, you know, who are you trying to reach?
So I think if you go into nonprofit news, you will all learn an entirely new vocabulary. And one of the things that they will talk a lot about are civic catalysts.
Oh.
I know, doesn't that sound exciting? It's basically like people who are engaged enough to make something happen. And that doesn't have to be election administrators. It doesn't have to be legislators. It can be sort of like a really active citizen who shows up at the city council or the county commissioner's court every week.
It's for gadflies.
It's for gadflies. It's for all of us who hate ourselves, yes. And so that's who we're sort of aiming at, right? Like, we're not making voter guides. We're not sort of doing like a how to vote policy, because major metro dailies are going to do that better than we can. We're statewide, we're not local. Those need to be very local, or they're sort of missing facts and context. And so we're sort of focused on people who are already sort of like basically aware of the system. But the great thing about our site is that it's Creative Commons licensed. And so We also have partner newsrooms in every state that we're in. So in Texas, it's the Texas Tribune. In Pennsylvania, it's PA Spotlight, on and on. And so our news is getting read by lots of people, but they're not necessarily coming to Votebeat site to get it, right? So the people who are coming to our site tend to be election administrators. They tend to be academics studying voting. And so this has become really interesting. Our newsletter that goes out every Saturday morning is probably about a third of the people who get it are election administrators. And so we get real quick feedback when they feel like we've done something wrong. Yeah.
They know some stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned 5 newsrooms.
Yeah.
Why 5 and where are they?
So we've got 4 of the states probably won't surprise you. 1 of them might, right? We've got Arizona and Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin, swing states all around. We also have Texas, and this might just be regional bias. I am from there. I live there. Whoop. And
so do some others.
And so do some others. And I think that Texas, it both feels like inevitable and impossible that Texas is going to become a swing state any day now. And so that's part of the reason that we're there. But the other part of the reason that we're there is that Texas sets standards, right? It's a huge state. The politicians there are incredibly influential. So laws passed in Texas get copied elsewhere. And so if we have a good hold on the Texas legislature and a good hold on what the major counties in Texas are doing with voting, it's a good guide for sort of thinking about the rest of the country. And so those are the 5 states.
And when you say they're newsrooms, these are not physical newsrooms, right?
No, we're all digital, which is on one hand challenging. For all of the reasons that you would imagine that it's challenging, right? Like, we are dealing with people in every time zone in the United States. We have someone in Phoenix, we have someone in DC. We all have to find a time where all of these people can be in the same room when we have editorial meetings. So that can be trying. But also it means that we are sort of like very authentically locally driven. So all of our reporters must live in the states that they cover. And we really didn't consider applications from people who didn't already live in the state. And that's really because we wanted them to be there and to be of that place and to have that reflected in their coverage. And so, this allows us to hire anybody, right? Any journalist in the whole state of Texas. Like, we don't have a newsroom. They don't have to be in Austin. Elections are administered at the local level, not necessarily the state level, even if legislation that the state is passing affects local election administration. So our Texas reporter lives in Corpus Christi, and she's the best reporter I've ever worked with, and I'm so excited to have her.
So the Hearst lecture is particularly interested or meant to be interested in innovation. And I know that you guys have done some interesting stuff. So tell us.
Oh my goodness. Well, so now that we're sort of established, we are trying to sort of take our expertise and turn it outwards. We're working with the Knight Foundation to do 2 things this election cycle. So the first is that, I'll back up just a little bit and say that all of our journalists, before they can write a story at all, have to go through 2 weeks of training on election administration with me, and they have to read 4 books. And then they can start writing stories. They're not allowed to write anything until they do that. And we do that because election administration is so freaking complicated, right? Like, you can cover local politics for your entire career and never know what a logic and accuracy test is. You can cover politics your entire career and have never gone to a procurement meeting to pick out voting machines or talk to a voting technologist. Like, this is a really hyper specific thing to cover and to know a lot about. And so we've digitized the first half of that training. So learn.votebeat.org, you can go, and you will learn the exact same things that our reporters learn in little increments. You got to sign up for it because, weirdos are out there, and we have to not Anyway, but it's free. It's free. And then the other thing that we're doing this year is that we have a Slack channel. I'm like essentially dumping my source Rolodex out and inviting any journalist that wants to participate to have my sources. So we have created a huge...
You mean any journalist anywhere?
Any journalist anywhere. They have to have an editor, they have to be publishing with a specific place, and they have to have a published ethics guideline. And that's because all of these experts, and there are 83 of them doing this, are participating on the record. So in each of these 5 channels, election security, election administration, political violence, mis and disinformation, and a few others, you can just kind of fling a question out, and whoever is online at the time will give you an on-the-record answer to your question. And the reason that we are doing this is because I think that journalists typically write the correct thing if they've got access to good sources. If they have access to shit sources, they're gonna do crappy work. And I think that is often what has happened on election administration and voting issues, because they want to call the same people that they've been calling for everything else. They don't know who the county clerk is. They don't know who's supposed to know a lot about the voting machine that their county uses. So they call their local state representative who was elected in this process. So why wouldn't they know about how the process itself works? Well, they don't, right? They don't know anything about the mechanics of voting. They are just on the ballot. Or they talk to the people who are sending press releases. And y'all have all been in journalism for at least long enough to know that people who send out press releases are often charlatans. And this is specifically problematic when every election cycle, right? Every 4 years, you get all of a sudden every cybersecurity company does election security, right? Oh my gosh, right? They have no expertise in this whatsoever. All of a sudden, every political scientist knows about local election administration policies, and every political consulting company wants to talk to you about the cleanliness of the voter rolls or how everybody's been purged, right? And more often than not, they're wrong in at least part of what they're telling the journalist, but they know more about it than the journalist, and so the journalist writes it. And that's how mis and disinformation on this subject spreads, often in good faith. And so our thought was that if we can reduce the friction between journalists and sources, and we can represent that these sources study election administration, know what they're talking about. They're former secretaries of states of both parties, former election administrators of both parties, professors. We're partnered with MIT and Caltech on this. So these are some legit people who are donating a lot of their time to this cause. And so this Slack channel is going to be open between October 15th and December 11th, which is Safe Harbor Day. It's the last day everything has to be certified. And our idea is hopefully that by giving journalists widespread access to really awesome sources, we sort of float all boats and we lift everybody up just a little bit. And so maybe I'm just
that's
overly optimistic.
That sounds like a good plan.
Yeah, I think
Wish
I'm
you
really
luck with that.
excited about it.
I'm wondering about the revenue model for Votebeat, and I also, as the director of an ethics center, was extremely impressed with your extremely long and detailed code of ethics.
It's extremely long.
But it's really good. So tell me about how you stay afloat. How do you pay people, and how do you deal with the problem that often happens with donations and grants and gifts, which is people have expectations about how that money should go to work?
That's a good question. I think that we have an easier time with this for a couple of reasons. So Elizabeth Green, who founded Chalkbeat and is great, and has now done Votebeat and also Healthbeat, right, has a theory that I think is absolutely correct, that it is easier to raise money on an issue area than it is on a region. And so, because you kind of run out of regional foundations at some point, right? You don't necessarily run out of foundations that care broadly about democracy or broadly about education or broadly about health, right? And so we can both go to these regional grant makers that give money to local newsrooms that are nonprofits across the country, and also to foundations that have specific interest in democracy issues and voting and civic engagement and all that comes with that. And so that's where, I mean, now we're about 4 years old now, and so we're starting to see more small dollar donors and people who like give us $5 a month and as a recurring donation. But you know, that's really what seeded us thus far is these foundation grants. And so I spend a lot of my time sort of like shilling for our reporters and talking about how amazing they are, which is not something that I anticipated doing when I walked these hallowed halls. Right. But here we are, so.
And so how does your ethics, policy play into how, sort of the guardrails around gifts and grants and donations?
Yeah, so I think, we have a very specific ethics policy that is very like sort of hardcore about how our donors can or cannot interact with our reporters. But we have a little bit of a leg up here because we do one thing, right? We do, there's not a lot of range of like what Votebeat covers. Like if you give Votebeat money, you know what you're giving us money to do. You're giving us money to cover the policy of voting. You're giving us money to buy thousands of dollars worth of voter data and crunch it. You are giving us travel stipends so that our Texas reporter can go to any of the 254 counties in the state and make it work, right? And so the people that we approach for funding have less of an expectation that their funding is going to affect our coverage in any way, because you can't really. Like, this is what we cover, and we cover voting policy, and that's it, right? And so if you don't want us to cover that, you don't give us money. And so that's...
They know this going in, too.
And they know this going in, right? They've got a very good idea of sort of what we cover and what we do and the types of journalism that we're willing to do. And, and I think that sometimes the conversations that we have with donors are about expectation setting. A lot of donors come... We can talk more about this, but, every newsroom now has a democracy reporter, right? And
or a whole desk.
Yeah, or a whole desk, and everybody. And like the problem with that is that democracy is an idea. It is not a beat. And so when people say, "Oh, you cover democracy," sometimes what they hear and what we do are two different things. Like, we cover voting policy. Like, if you're defining democracy coverage by extremism, and that's what you cover, right? Right-wing extremism, and that's what you think democracy coverage looks like, then you're going to be disappointed with what we ultimately do with your money. And so I think a lot of it is about sort of emphasizing that we are a policy shop. And that we are covering the mechanics of voting and not who you vote for or the manner in which people talk about voting on podcasts or whatever. And so if that expectation is set, and it's becoming easier and easier to do that as we sort of have a body of work that we can point to and give examples of, then it becomes easier and easier to sort of make them realize that like we're not going to cover the campaigns with your money. We're not going to have a live results, like we're not going to have a live blog about results on election day.
It's not what you do.
It's not what we do.
Right.
And so as long as those conversations are had, then it's fine.
So let's switch gears a little bit, although we may come back to some of this. But you have an unusual job. And I think a lot of people in this room are interested in, what the industry looks like right now, what the job market looks like. How do you get from being a grad student here to a very high level editorial job that did not even exist 4 years ago? Like, give us your big picture look at the field of journalism and, some of how you've navigated it.
Yeah, one of the more useful pieces of advice that I got when I was starting out in my career is that nobody's gonna help you. Nobody is gonna help you. You helped me. It's very nice. There are people, like, while you're here, there are people that are going to help you. When you get to your newsroom, like, if you expect professional development, if you expect them to sit you down and teach you how to write a FOIA, if you expect them to sit you down and teach you how to make a graphic or whatever, they're not going to do it. Like, you've got to go in with everything that you need to know, or be willing to teach it to yourself while you're on the job. And so when I was here, I had the advantage of being, like, a little bit older than some of the students that were here. I had been a high school teacher prior to coming to Columbia. I had an undergraduate journalism degree from, like, frankly, a terrible journalism school, so I didn't know which end was up. And so I, didn't know that much about journalism, didn't go into it, became a high school teacher in Newark, New Jersey, and then got into Columbia Journalism School. But I was, like, far enough along that I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I got out. Like,
So how old were you when you were here?
I was about 25,
Okay.
which I realize it's not that old, but
I
is
think that's actually not atypical.
not
now.
atypical now. Okay, that's good, because when I was here, it was, like, very much like this was sort of like a 5th year of college for a lot of people, and that's an interesting way to approach journalism school. But I think also, because I had a defined idea of the type of journalism I wanted to do, I could select all of the classes sort of that specifically tailored to being, like, an investigative data journalist that at the time wanted to cover, like, kid policy, right? Like, I'd been a teacher, I wanted to cover child welfare, I wanted to cover education. That's what my master's project was about. And I did that for a little while. I was, a fellow doing investigative education journalism at Columbia for a program that no longer exists. And then I did healthcare reporting for 2 months for ProPublica before they were like, do you want a job? And I was like, yes, please. And they were like, great, you cover voting now. And I was like, sounds good. And that was the whole thing. That's how I became a voting reporter. So I think...
But let me stop you for a second. So you really didn't have any particular interest in voting stuff.
No.
Election stuff.
No.
It was that you were at ProPublica, but you weren't hired there yet.
Right. The first job that I got at ProPublica, my fellowship at Columbia was ending, and I was like, I really want to work at ProPublica, like, really, really bad.
Because it's one of the best
Because
places.
it's awesome,
Yes.
right? And so I was looking on their website, and I had Charles Ornstein as my investigating healthcare professor here. I'm sure he still teaches that class here. But Charlie listed a job for a 7-week internship. It paid, and I'm not endorsing this at all, and they have since raised the pay, $700 a week, no benefits. And so that's what I got paid for being, like, essentially just running a bunch of SQL queries for Charlie. And it was great. Like, I mean, I learned so much.
And you knew him only because of this place.
Because of this place, yeah. So my master's project advisor was Tracy Weber, who was an editor there. And Charlie had been my investigating healthcare professor. So I had, like, a little bit of an in. And so when I applied, I wasn't sort of going in cold. I had people that I could sort of lean on to move my application along. And so I got that, and I was determined, even though there was no chance, there was no guarantee at the end that they would extend my internship or that another one would come. Like, ProPublica opens up fellowships on an annual basis or as funding allows. And so there weren't any open when I took this 7-week job. And so I just worked my fingers off.
So you had a foot in the door.
I had a foot in the door, but ProPublica is not the type of place that matters after you get there, right?
I understand it wasn't going to get you the job, but it helped you.
But it helped me get in the door. And so once I got in the door, I had to just, like, hustle for all that I was worth. And so at the
I think this is really useful. This is it right here.
This is, you gotta hustle. Like, this is a terrible, awful industry. And the only way, I'm sorry, you need to hear it right now. The only way that you're gonna survive in it and you're gonna advance in it is if you hustle and you take the shots that are presented to you and you take them seriously. And so at the end of my 7 weeks, I was sitting at my like awful desk with my awful computer that they assigned to temporary employees. And Robin Fields, who was the managing editor at the time, came up and she was like, next week, can you do? And I was like, this is actually the last day of my internship. And she was like, let's pretend it isn't. And I was like,
okay.
Okay.
Another $700.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks. And so then they opened up a senior fellowship that I got, which came with $800 a week and benefits. So
Benefits.
I know. Now they pay their fellows significantly more than that. But at the time, that was what was going, and I thought I was like rolling in it. So I stayed on for a year, and when they gave me that year-long fellowship, they were like, we're going to do this thing. It's called Election Land. You're going to be the intern, but also the lead reporter. And I was like, how much are you going to pay me again? But I did it, right? And I just sort of like hustled my butt off and made it happen. And we sort of created this program out of whole cloth, like, and it went really well. We did it. We like ran it through CUNY Journalism School. We took over their whole journalism school on election night. We worked with hundreds of students, several of them from Columbia, actually. And it went really well, right?
What were you doing? What was the coverage?
So in the same way that I'm currently trying to reduce the friction between journalists and good sources on election administration, the way that journalists have covered voting and voting issues in the past is that they sort of just like stick their youngest employees in their car and they're like, drive around to the polling locations until you find something to talk about. And that's like the worst way to do journalism. It's impossible to do journalism, and it's like total luck of the draw. And so what we decided we would do is create this software, which I did not create because I don't do that, but ProPublica has very smart people, and they created this software, which for some reason we called Landslide. And what it did was, like after the Fleetwood Mac song, and what it did was it pulled all of the data from 866-RVOTE, which is the nation's biggest hotline for voter issues, and then a couple of other places, like a couple of state parties that had like APIs we could tap into, a couple of like stupid little apps where you could report voter fraud, but like a tip is a tip, you know what I mean? And so we pulled all of them into this one place, and then we hired a ton of temporary employees to go through all of these tips and verify them, determine which ones were real, which ones weren't. Voters often report problems that aren't really problems. You only vote once every 4 years. It's not something you get good at, you know what I mean? So you gotta kind of like, there's the signal to noise ratio is quite poor. And so we had to kind of cull that out and verify that things were happening. And then we had hundreds of local newsrooms sign up to get our tips. And so once our catchers had determined that this information was legitimate and worth reporting, we would push it to a local newsroom. And we would say like, here it is, here's the story, here's the person on the ground that you can talk to. And if you need sources, let us know in our expert desk channel and we'll connect you with some. And so what we were doing is trying to give newsrooms like reporting recipes for better reporting on voting, so that the youngest employees in the newsroom who were given the crappiest jobs were still writing good stories, right? The good journalism was not isolated to people who were doing the horse race coverage and thinking only about the campaigns, because that's where most newsrooms invest their senior reporting staff and also the majority of their money. And so if voting is going to sort of take second fiddle to everything else, we wanted to make sure that they had as many resources as we could give them. And so it evolved a little bit. I did it for them in 2016, which was a hell of a ride, and 2018 and 2020. And so it evolved each time to be slightly different, but the mechanics were basically the same. Like, we're going to take the tips, we're going to verify the tips, we're going to push them out as news tips to local newsrooms.
So when you say that you, when you converted your original 7-week thing to, were you able to convert it to a 1-year fellowship?
Yes.
Well, and you say that you hustled.
Hustled.
But what does that look like? I mean, what does that mean? How did you do that? And how much did that involve actual journalism work, and how much, if at all, did it involve, schmoozing, et cetera?
Yes. So my internship was so short, and I don't know if any of you know Charlie Ornstein, but he has just tremendously high expectations. Like, he is the hardest boss I have ever had in my life, and I think he will remain that. And I love him. He was great. Like, I would work for him again. But he has incredibly high standards. And so because his standards were so high, I really didn't have time to do anything but journalism. Like, he sat me down on my first week, and like, ProPublica takes months to do anything, right? Like, glacial pace this newsroom moves at. And I had 7 weeks, and he was like, all right, in your 7 weeks, you're going to write 6 stories. And I was like, holy shit, are you serious, man? And I just had to look at him and be like, absolutely, totally, I'm definitely going to do that. And so I just figured it out. And I think that, that I had a data background that came from here. Like, this was before the formal data journalism program at Columbia, but I'd taken enough data classes that I could crunch data, and in the healthcare, and it was a healthcare beat. And so there were enough reliable databases that it wasn't an impossible task for me to find really awesome stories in not that long of a time. And so one of the first stories that I did that just was a gift that kept on giving was so in every state there's a medical board. You can look up your doctors and see if they have any discipline on their record. Doctors also have to report to the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Services when they take money from a pharmaceutical company, either because they're consulting or because they attend a dinner or whatever. And so I decided to merge these two lists to see. It took so long. It was so much harder than I thought it would be. And I stayed up till 3 o'clock in the morning a lot of days, going line by line to make sure this guy was the same as this guy in this database. But I stuck those together and found some crazy stuff, right? And so it allowed me to sort of constantly pitch stories where I'm like, oh, this bad doctor got paid $40,000 last year to consult on spinal equipment.
Was that your idea to merge the two lists?
Yes.
See, now this is unfair. She's brilliant.
Oh, well, thanks. That's very nice. But I think, that's one of the most useful things that I was taught in journalism school was the stories are not in the databases. They're in the databases that you can create, right? They're not in the database everybody has access to. They're in this database everybody has access to, the second database everybody has access to that I have put together. And I'm getting new information out of, because that's just sort of how it works, right? If a database exists, other journalists who are certainly smarter than I was when I was a 7-week intern at ProPublica would have already found that story. So I had to find something else. And so that, I had a very sort of poor understanding when I walked in the door of how healthcare data worked and functioned. And so I had to kind of and there wasn't anybody that was going to sit down and teach me, right? Charlie didn't sit down and teach me. He just expected that I would know. And I did not. I did not know anything. And so I was just sort of staring at my awful computer and rows and rows and rows of data until they made sense. And I think that drive, right? That ability to just nobody's going to help me. I've got to sit down and I've got to figure this out, and I can't complain about it that nobody's helping me, because nobody's helping anybody here. That's not what this place is. You just have to do it. And so I did it. And I wrote the stories that Charlie expected me to write. And so
Did you write 7 or 6?
I did.
How many were in the last 2 weeks?
Almost killed me. I will say that 2 of the stories were like short little blippy follow-ups. And I was like, look, 6, woo. So
Expectations.
I'm soaring over them.
That's
And so, that's how it went. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So you hire reporters now,
I do.
and you must be looking for certain kinds of things. I mean, you hire, I think we talked about this on the phone, relatively junior, maybe not entry level, but relatively junior reporters. So what is it? What are the qualities, and what are you looking for? What has paid off?
That's a great question. So this is a information space that is full of bullshit artists. And so what we're genuinely...
Election stuff.
Yes.
The mechanics of voting.
The mechanics of voting, and the people who want to tell you about how wrong everything is and how bad everything is or how good everything is, right? Like, most of these people are lying to you. And so if you don't have a good detector, you're not going to make it in voting reporting. And in fact, we've cycled through a few reporters who...
Like too credulous.
Yes, so that like believe what they're being told and then submit the story to me, and I'm like, all of this is wrong, right? And we will let people go if that's like a track record of theirs, because we have like our reporters cover statewide voting issues, and so they're getting hit from all sides in their states with information that is both true and false or somewhere in the middle, and they have to be able to on their own sort of sort through all of that. Like, of course, like I am here to help them, and I've been covering this for years, and I can often speed that process along. But part of the reason that we do such intensive training is to sort of give them the ability to have that detector. But you can't just, like, knowing a lot about voting doesn't really make you good at knowing whether or not somebody is lying to you. It doesn't really make you good at sort of sorting out, like, that's an advocate, and that's an elected official, and that's an academic, and they have the following motivations, and this is how they might differ, and this is why they might be talking to me about this. Like, we were looking for people who had a track record of doing that. And we were looking for people
But not necessarily in voting stuff.
Not necessarily in voting at all, yeah. So one of our reporters was an immigration reporter for the Austin American-Statesman. Another one was a data reporter that mostly did environmental stuff for the Detroit News. Another person covered political extremism in rural Pennsylvania. None of them were voting reporters because there aren't any, right? There are no voting reporters
Now there
out
are.
there. Now there are. Now we have 5. But at the time, like, you have to find people who are really good at what they do, that like can be taught the information that they need in order to do what they do, just in a different area. And so it's been a really interesting learning exercise for me, because prior to this, I had never really hired anyone. I'd hired temporary staff for ProPublica. I had like some amount of say in who our interns were, but I was not hiring full-time employees. And so it was an interesting sort of path to create what our ideal Votebeat reporter looked like, because the newsroom didn't even exist.
So when we talked on the phone, you mentioned that the people you've hired, I think you said they have all come out of local newspapers in the States. So Austin American-Statesman and
Detroit News, the Lancaster Daily.
Right. So does it concern you that local newspapers are as troubled as they are? I mean, because it sounds like it's kind of your farm team.
It's our farm team, that's true. Yes, I mean, it does concern me, and it concerns me for more than one reason, right? I think the talent pool is dwindling because there are fewer entry-level jobs, and so they leave journalism and go into PR or communications or marketing or whatever, right? Because they can't get a job in journalism, or at least not one that pays like a livable wage. See $700 a week, no benefits. And so, that's a problem. But also for our industry, like for what we cover specifically, voting is so local, right? It is the way that this county votes is different from the way that the county next door votes, is different from the way that the county next door to that votes. And so the depletion of hyperlocal media really has meant a lowering of nuance in the way that this information is covered. And that's not just true for voting, right? That's true for local education policy and local labor policy, but that's sort of what we're seeing. And so, now we're having to pull our reporters from like big papers. And so,
You have to pay them more.
we have to pay them more, and that's fine. Like, we should be paying all journalists more. And that was like one of the sticking points that I had when I took the job, was like, we have a minimum salary that we pay reporters. And so, it's harder to find people, and it's harder to find people who are willing to take risks. Like, when we were first hiring our first round of people, what we were offering was like, come work for this newsroom you've never heard of, covering this thing you don't know anything about. Like, nobody, who was gonna do that? And like, the people who wanna do that are like local reporters who need a leg up to get to the next thing, right? Like, they need to see that as like a path forward. It was very difficult for us to convince people like that worked for the Detroit Free Press that they should come be our Votebeat Michigan reporter, because they were like, why would I do that? I have this job. Like, or, why would I leave the Dallas Morning News to come and cover voting for y'all? One reason was that we paid better than most of these places, so that
Very
helped.
persuasive.
That was very persuasive. But also, there was no guarantee that like our newsroom would exist in 2 years.
Well, it's no guarantee that their newsrooms will exist either.
Fair point. Yes. And so, it was hard to get folks that had a track record of good journalism, that were eager to leave where they were. And so we got sort of like two buckets of people, which was like people who had not done very well at their major metro dailies and were looking to leave, or people who had never really done hardcore investigative reporting before and really just wanted to make voter guides, which is not what we do. And so it took a really long time, several rounds of interviews, to find the right people for these positions.
So we're going to go to questions, and so you can start to line up. This is a great opportunity to talk to Jessica, but while that's happening, I would like to ask you what your advice is to the graduate students in the room about how to, how to make it and what to do, and sort of what would you tell them based on your experience?
Get really good at covering something. I think that a lot of people, like this was the best piece of advice when I was an intern at ProPublica. I was an intern. Annie Waldman, who still works there, was like, you will get hired here if when your internship is up, they realize that no one else can cover what you've been covering. And so I just went hard at voting and learned everything about it and became the go-to person in the newsroom for everything voting related. And that worked. Like, when my internship was up, they were like, wow, who's gonna run election land next time? Me, give me a job. And that's how I got my job. And that's how I also sort of like parlayed my expertise into building a new newsroom, right? I think people think that, the type of journalism that you do is really important, or the medium that you choose is really crucial to your success. But I think what is actually crucial is your reporting expertise in a specific field. And so that would be my best piece of advice, is make yourself indispensable. And the best way to do that is to get really good at either something no one else can do, like data visualization, or know something that nobody else knows a lot about, like election policy, for example.
But it could be a lot of things.
But it could be a lot of things. It could be a ton of things, yeah.
Okay, so you're up.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I'm in the Stabile Investigative Program. I'm
yay.
originally from Iowa, which was a swing state for the majority of my life, but no longer is. So I was wondering how Votebeat kind of factors in the definition of a swing state and what states fall on that definition when they come to have those reporters or potentially expand your business.
That's such a good question. So we have sort of a two-part test of whether or not we're going to go into a state. It is, one, are there voting things happening there? In swing states, there tend to be, right? But that's not our bar. It's like, it doesn't need to be a swing state. It just needs to be a place where lots of things are happening in voting. And two, is the local media already covering it well, right? So like, we are not in Georgia because the Georgia Public Broadcast and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution do fine. We are not in Florida because the Tampa Bay Times covers this really well. And anything that we did in those places would be duplicative, right? And so if the ecosystem exists for good voting reporting, then we're not gonna touch that state. So that's sort of the two-part test. But also, you know, like, nothing is happening in voting in Minnesota. Let me just tell you. It is the easiest state to vote in the world. It's great. Everything's fine there. Like, what would we cover? I genuinely have no idea.
There have to be problems, right?
Yeah, there have to be problems in order for us to cover them.
Hence Texas.
Hence Texas, yes, exactly. So Texas is not necessarily a swing state, but it's such a big state that the local media struggles to cover any part of it particularly well. And so partnering with the Texas Tribune and being a Creative Commons licensed newsroom allows these newspapers to republish our stuff. And that's really what we want. I think that the majority of people who read an article written by one of our reporters don't realize that they work for Votebeat. They assume that they work for
Spotlight PA.
Spotlight PA or the Texas Tribune.
Hi, thank
Hello
you so
again.
much. Hello again. Thank you so much for being here. You know, I'm a huge fan of your work and you've had an incredible career. I was wondering if you'd be comfortable sharing a difficult situation or one of the more challenging moments that you faced while setting up Votebeat or in your career more broadly, and how did you navigate it?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, yes, the answer is 1,000 times yes. I had many strange moments. I think that sourcing as a young female is really difficult. And so, I will not name this person, but someone from a national newsroom contacted me when I was at Columbia and about to graduate. And they were like, let's have dinner next time you're in DC. And I was like, oh, yes. Like, this is it. Like, someone's noticed. He thought we were going on a date. So I accidentally went on a date with this man. I was at the time married. And so it was awkward all around, right? And so setting up those really professional sort of boundaries was an interesting thing to navigate, right? I had previously been a high school teacher, and so the boundaries are pretty friggin' clear. You know what I mean? Like, I'm in the front of this room, and you are sitting down. I am a teacher, you are a student. It didn't really matter that my students were only 3 years younger than I was when I started teaching, because I was teaching high school seniors, and I was 21. Like, that didn't matter. Like, our roles were significantly different enough that there was sort of this societal expectation of how we would treat each other. And, those norms are broken, obviously, but like, it's easier to fall into them. When you're a young female reporter, especially in investigative journalism, which even today is predominantly male, those boundaries are more difficult to navigate.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Deep. I'm also in the investigative program. I was wondering, because there is a seasonality to elections, that would also mean that things might look operationally and financially different for Votebeat depending on what year it is.
Mm-hmm.
So could you speak to what that looks like, and what would a reporter at Votebeat, what would a typical day for them look like in an off election year? Yeah.
That's a great question. I'm really glad you asked it. So we do the majority of our fundraising in election years. That won't surprise you. So we try to raise 3 years worth of funding every time we have an election year. So that's that year's funding, the next year's funding, and gap in case we like really suck at fundraising the next year. And so right now we are like hustling, and because we know that this is where people are interested, and like that's not lost on us. But one of the things that we talk a lot about with our donors and in every event that we do is that there isn't really an off year for voting, right? Like local elections are happening all the time. And so if voting is well covered, then there isn't an off season. And certainly I think that one of the reasons that we have a bit of a leg up when it comes to voting season is because we've been doing this the whole time, right? Like no county is making massive choices or changes to the voting process in a federal election year, right? That is not the year they buy voting machines. That is not the year that they change poll worker rules unless the legislature makes them, right? But no county is doing that. Like the big moves, the big technology buys, the big policy shifts, the new voting warehouse that has really good or really bad physical security, whatever, right? Those are all being built in off years. And so we're there, right? Like we're there. And so by the time that the election comes around and people are making false claims about the voting machines, right? Everybody else is like, what kind of voting machines do we have actually? And I'm like, page 37 of the manual will answer this question, right? Like that's what allows us to do that, is that sort of off-year focus. And so I think that is slowly something that our donors are starting to understand. And so even since I've been there, we're raising more money because we have more to do now. We have more reporters than we did when I started. So it's not an apples to apples comparison, but like sort of off year, on year fundraising has not leveled out, but has come closer together. And that's encouraging for me to see, because I think one, it means that we'll be able to stick around for a little bit longer. And two, our donors better understand the space. And so they can sort of participate more actively as funders in that way.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's CJ. I'm in the data journalism program.
Fun.
And it is very fun. I'm curious, I really liked what you said about like the biggest value add as a data journalist being creating your own data sets or joining data sets. Is your organization trying to do that yourselves or trying to publish those data sets? And if not, I'm curious about like how you use data in terms of election policy in general.
Yes, we do a lot of this. And so one of the things that we're doing, so like right now we're about to publish a story. I'll just give you this as an example. Maricopa County in Arizona, where Phoenix is. Yeah, well, yeah. And for better or worse, we all know where that is now. They rejected about 1,600 ballots in the midterms because of mismatched signatures, which is a really bullshit way of like determining whether or not this person is the one who cast their ballot for like a whole load of reasons. And so we were able to sort of like take what is like limitedly available in the public voter roll, match it with census data, and then match that with like USPS mailing data to contact all of those people again and be like, is this your signature actually? And they were all like, yes, that's my signature. Wow. But like your signature does not necessarily look the same every time you sign it, right? And especially if you're getting older or you have a disability or your name is complicated and like has a hyphen or sometimes doesn't, or has an inye, or sometimes you leave that off because you're going really fast, your signature is much more likely to be rejected. And so that was sort of conventional wisdom, but it was interesting to sort of prove that with the data that was available to us. And we've done a couple of other things as well. Right now we are sort of, Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, has made all of these sweeping claims about the hundreds of thousands of non-citizens that are on the voter roll. And as far as we can tell, he just like pulled that number out of thin air. And we know that because we can sort of like take the databases that are available to us and kind of work backwards from them. And so that's really what we're trying to do. Like our predominant database, we cover voting, is the voter roll, obviously. But there are so many things that we can use to add context to the voter roll, and that I think brings a lot of value to our readers.
Thank you.
Hi. You mentioned that many of your readers are election administrators.
Yeah.
What are they like? What are these people like?
Oh my God, they're awesome. They're really awesome. Like, I have met so many. I've been covering election administration, which is the nerdiest, most like tiny little space, since 2016. I have met literally hundreds of election administrators. I can think of 5 that I thought were either bad people or bad at their jobs. And I think it's so fun to cover these people because they love what they do. Like, I don't know if you've ever talked to a county clerk, but it's like living in an episode of Parks and Recreation. It's amazing. And so you roll into these offices and they're like jazzed about voting, and they just want to register you to vote. And they've been working for the county since they were 16 and got a job as a part-time clerk, and now they're the full-time tax assessor, and that somehow also manages voter registration and also manages property records. Like, these people are the sort of public face of their counties, not literally, right? Like, technically, I guess that's the mayor. But if you interact with county government, the office you're probably going to is the office that handles voter registration in some capacity, whether that's because you need to contest your taxes, or you got to file a property record, or you got to register to vote. Like, most of those things are all done in the clerk's office. And so they have to get up every day and be public servants in the truest sense of the word. And it is so much more fun to cover people who love to do their jobs than people who hate their jobs and everything that they stand for, right? Which is, I think, most American politicians, especially at the federal level, are done. These clerks are just jazzed about waking up every day and doing what they do. And so what that also means is that they feel seen by our newsroom. We're wow, Votebeat is a thing that covers what we do. And so they are extremely engaged. We get emails on emails, we get news tips you would not believe from these public servants who finally know that oh, if I call that journalist, I won't have to explain to them what a logic and accuracy test is. We can just get right to it. And we, I don't have to explain to them how a voting machine works, or why you can't hack a voting machine, or that, this basic information, right? All of these stupid things that they might have that might frustrate them about talking to other reporters, they don't have with us, because we know a lot about what they're talking about. So it's really fun. They're really fun people. I encourage you to go meet your county clerk. Genuinely, I do. They're amazing.
That's a great answer.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Mega, so nice to meet you. I kind of had a question about how you'll be covering the upcoming presidential and federal elections, especially with what we saw in 2020, how it kind of dragged on, and there were a lot of county clerks who were understaffed, especially in different states, perhaps states that you don't have a newsroom in. So I was curious, if you have a plan going into this election on how you're going to be covering that, or if that's just kind of on the fly kind of moment.
Yeah, I mean, our running theory, and one that I feel pretty confident in, is that voting in the vast majority of the country will be fine, right? Most voters are going to go to the polls and they're going to cast a ballot, and it's going to be incredibly boring, and they're going to forget that they've done that in 3 months. And that is as it should be. You know what I mean? And a few jurisdictions, things will go haywire, and we're prepared for that. But I think what's really going to take a lot of our focus and a lot of our attention is the post-election period. What 2020 taught us is that elections just never end unless both candidates are willing to let them. And so I think in the event of a Trump loss, we're looking at months of post-election litigation. And so that's part of the reason that we've made this expert desk, and that it runs through December 11th, is because we know that sort of election day is not really election day, right? Like that's not really where the party ends when all of the results are like announced, right? And so we're trying to prepare for it in that way. We know that we don't have a presence in a lot of the states where things could become pretty bad, right? Like North Carolina, Florida. These are states where like a confluence of things is making elections difficult to administer, not least that they've been like whacked by hurricanes. And so I think we can't be everywhere. Like we are in the states that we are in. We've made those choices. We gotta live with those choices. Like we've picked our battles. And so our sort of the service that we're providing to other newsrooms in those states is sort of how we're trying to accommodate the fact that we're not a national newsroom. And the great thing about sort of efforts like this that are collaborative is that very frequently newsrooms in these states that need help will come to us and they will say, hey, we have a reporter, but we have no idea what to tell this reporter to do. Like, will you edit the story and then we can co-publish it? And the answer to that is always yes. And so that's sort of how we're widening our footprint.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm Jake. Thank you for joining us. And I'm curious, just based off of what you were just talking about, are there any gaps within the New York area in terms of reporting on elections and voting that deserve a little bit more attention or a little bit more coverage?
Yes, the whole of New York City. I was saying this to Justine earlier, but the New York City Board of Elections is genuinely the worst board of elections in the entire country. Flat out, bar none. And if New York was not oversaturated with media, we would already be here. No one covers the Board of Elections in New York State or New York City because the boards that get the most scrutiny are in swing states or they're in hyper red states that are doing like objectively crazy shit, right? Like this is a bright blue, reliably liberal voting bloc. And so the ACLU and Common Cause and all of these places that tend to call attention to really atrocious acts by local boards don't see a lot of value in hyper focusing on New York. And I think that what people forget about New York is that like, yeah, like I guess it's the great blue whale or whatever, I don't know. But it's not an equitable place to live. Like, you all know that. You live here. It is a shitty place to live sometimes. And it is especially bad if you are poor. And it is especially bad if your voting location is far away and you don't have access to transportation. Or if you are disabled and none of the voting locations around you are disability accessible. And so I think because of how reliably blue this city is, the genuinely backwards election administration policies go totally unnoticed by the larger media. This is well before all of your time, right? But like, well, time as journalists, I assume, not on this earth. In 2013, the Shelby County decision removed pre-clearance. Like, is this making some sense to you guys? I don't know. But anyway, it used to be that there were a certain number of counties in the United States that had to pre-clear any changes to voting with the DOJ. In 2013, a Supreme Court case did away with that. 3 of New York City's 5 counties were pre-clearance districts. 3 of the 5. Like, that is a much higher ratio than like anywhere in Kentucky. Because this is not an equitable place to live. And this is a place that screws over minorities. And so I think that the wool has been a little bit pulled over the eyes of the media who like live here and work here and think it's a great place to be. And they don't really see the inequity that's happening right in front of them.
Sounds like a great story.
Yeah.
I would probably publish it.
There you
Just
go.
throwing that out there for your consideration. If you ask me anything weird, Alicia, I'm going to stick security
I'm not going to
on you.
embarrass you.
Okay.
Hi, my name's Alicia. I don't know Jessica Huseman at all. When you're a kid, right, everyone says they want to be an astronaut, or they want to be a doctor, and that's what you want to be. I know everything about you. I could literally steal all of your money tomorrow if I wanted to.
Yeah, you absolutely could.
I do not know when the pivotal moment was when you decided, going from a dance teacher to a teacher in high school to advocating for education and journalism to advocating for voting and all of that stuff. When was that pivotal moment for you when you realized this is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life and I really care about this?
Thank you, Alicia, for asking me a really gutting question. So, I think that there's like two answers to that. I think that when I realized that I wanted to stop teaching high school anyway and start journalism, it was 2013 when I applied to come to the journalism school. And I was already living on Columbia's campus because my ex-husband was a law student. So I had to walk through the camp, which now you can't do anymore, I guess. But I had to walk through the campus every day to get to the one train to get to Newark so that I could teach high school, right? Like, I already sort of felt like I was part of the campus. So this was the only school I applied to because I was like, if I don't get into Columbia, then it's not meant to be. Like, I was never meant to be a journalist. I will be a high school teacher for the rest of my life. And then I got in, and that was friggin' weird. I was like, wow, why have they allowed me to do this? And then I was put on the wait list initially for Stabile, and then got pulled off the wait list. So initially I was gonna defer, and then got pulled off and got some funding, and I was like, all right, let's do this. And the process of working on my master's project validated every choice that I made. So I created a database for my master's project on all of the homeschooling regulations in the country. Like, TLDR, there aren't any. And so and ProPublica eventually published it. But it was just sort of working on that and doing my first investigation and crunching this data and putting all of these skills to work. And I was like, oh, I can do this. This is great. And I think that when I realized that I wanted to cover voting for like a really long time, 2016 moved so fast. So all of a sudden, I was the lead elections reporter at ProPublica, despite being an intern. They have an entire team dedicated to democracy now. I was just me in 2016. And I was doing, and they were like, and you also have to do live hits on PBS NewsHour every hour on election day. And I was like, what? I've never even been on television. And so I got off one of these interviews, and the person who was interviewing me was like, wow, I wish I knew as much about anything as you know about voting. And which was the most flattering, and I knew jack shit, to be honest with you. I'm just a really good talker. And so that was really validating. And I was like, oh, this is actually a thing that people know nothing about. If what I am giving you is expertise and you're recognizing that as something new and different, then there is a ton of uncharted territory here that I can help map out. And so that was fun. And it was fun to be accidentally in the right beat at the right time, right? I was one of very few reporters in the country that were covering voting and voting policy in 2016 when Donald Trump started saying a bunch of weird stuff, right? And so all of a sudden, I had this really important job, and I could see it making a difference to people and having impact, and that was really cool. So,
great question, great answer. All right, we are at our last question, and after that we will proceed to the reception. And this has been so great, but this might be who knows? This could be even greater. Okay, go for it.
Hi, I'm Andrea. I'm an MA student in the Business and Economics concentration. And actually, I'm one of the Charles Ornstein student. I'm taking his class. And I was wondering, did you know about his expectation only when you went to ProPublica or also before during this class? Because
No, oh my God. Let me tell you something.
Okay, then
Charlie was the hardest professor that I had, but he was the greatest professor because he had a syllabus and he followed it, right? And like, he expected you to do the reading that was on that syllabus. Like, if you just did what he said, you were going to do really well. And our first assignment in investigating healthcare was to file a records request with about any hospital in the country, and find a story in those inspection reports. And I came to journalism school with this like personal goal that I wasn't going to write anything if the only purpose of it was to be read by my professor. Like, I wanted to publish everything that I wrote. And so I was like, I guess I'll send a records request about this mental health hospital that I know anecdotally to be totally screwed in Dallas, because one time I interned at the Dallas Morning News and maybe they'll take the story if I find something really nuts. And so we filed the request with both the federal and state government. The state government one came back first. And I was in Columbia, Missouri at a wedding, and I got a phone call from Charlie. Like, this is like a Friday night, and I am just a student, right? Like, and he's like, "Hi, your pitches are bad." And I was like, "Oh, what do you mean?" He was like, "None of these are stories and you need to keep going." And like, the next day, by total happenstance, I got the federal ones, and they were slightly more up to date than the state ones, because I'd gotten them later. And there was a woman at one of these hospitals that had committed suicide in her room because she was just like not properly seen to. And that was like that became a series of stories for the Dallas Morning News. And his expectations on those stories were significantly higher than the editors I worked with at the Dallas Morning News. And I was like, oh wow, like he's his own thing. So when I started working for him, I was terrified, to be honest with you, because I was like, I'm gonna fail. Like, I'm not gonna do this well. But I knew going in that he was gonna be rough, and he was. But I learned more in that 7 weeks, I think, than I might have learned in all of journalism school. And that's not a knock on Columbia. I learned a lot here. Charlie's just nuts.
Thank you. And last thing, you said that after the master, you did a fellowship here, and then you went to ProPublica. Going back, do you think it would have been better going straight to ProPublica?
Oh, I think I would have loved it, but I don't think they would have given me a job. Right? Like, I was a baby journalist, right? Like, I'd had like a journalism internship or two in undergrad, and then came to Columbia and published a bunch of stuff while I was here, but it like was nothing of the caliber that ProPublica would expect even from an internship. And so it was called the Teacher Project when I was here. And so what we did was we like embedded in schools and wrote about whatever we were writing about for those schools. So I would be like in a school for 2 or 3 weeks. And that is really, I think, what gave ProPublica the confidence that they could hire me, because I was like, I had written and published things of the length that they expected. And so my application was unique among the other intern applications, because everybody else is applying having done like this internship or that internship, even if it was at the New York Times, but very few of them were writing 5,000 word stories. And so that was like a unique opportunity that I was afforded here. And I'm really thankful for it.
Thanks for those great questions, and thank you, Jessica. This was really fun and really helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.